So hey, 2018. That sure was a year that happened. Over 4 months ago at this point, as I sit here in early May, finally getting around to recording the script. Yeah, I know I'm late to the party and nobody really cares at this point, but I felt like 2018 was a particularly strong year for new releases, at least personally. And giving the year proper closure with a full-fledged top 10 list was something I've been planning to do for a long time. I will preface this by saying that my tastes heavily lean towards progressive and metal music, and a lot of my picks are informed by that, but there's one thing about this list that ultimately surprised me. Everything in my top 10 is released from a band that I've never heard of before 2018. Hell, there have been some debuts on here. I feel that alone is what made this list worth putting together for me. And I hope that anyone watching this finds something you've never heard about but fall in love with just as much as I have with these albums. But before I get onto the list proper, I just want to quickly run through a list of honorable mentions that I couldn't not talk about even if they missed the cut. Starting with following the disappointing Coma Ecliptic, I was pretty surprised at how much I liked this one. I'd even call my favorite of theirs since The Great Misdirect, though it definitely isn't to that level either. I tend to agree with the general consensus here that Part 2 is a lot stronger than Part 1, though throughout both I appreciate how effective and memorable a lot of melodic work here is. Though I can see the general lack of the weirder elements they become known for alienating some longtime fans, as there's really only one track here, Voice of Trespass, that turns that weirdness style up, with the rest of it being pretty straightforward. For me though, this got me back on board with this band after the last few releases had turned me off on them, and that's not something every band can pull off. Well, this is right up the alley of the kind of metal I've been really into lately. Intense, over-the-top, and very colorful melodic death metal with some symphonic and progressive edges to it as well. Usually, I tend to shy away from symphonic metal genres as the symphonic elements tend to overshadow the metal elements, but here I feel they really find that perfect balance to accentuate both without sacrificing the quality of the other. There's a lot going on in each of these songs, and that's where the weaknesses of this record start to show, since every song is so overstuffed with ideas that few really get time to simmer. It also means that all the songs sound kind of similar even if they're individually diverse within themselves. I still come back to this one regularly to this day though, so there's definitely something about this one that works for me even if I'm not fully on board with it. Haken are a band I'm almost obligated to follow on cover, considering that I've been a fan for over a decade since their demo album. And the latest iteration of their sound takes their core sound that has developed over the past few albums and mixes it with more jagged and djenty elements. For me, it works surprisingly well, as the songwriting is very focused and cohesive and their hooks are as good as ever. It is notably less diverse than their previous records though, with only one song reprieving from the heaviness present throughout most of the album, and the album's epic, Veil, isn't up to the standards of really any of their past epics. Regardless, I do see this as a slight improvement from Infinity, though not nearly as strong as Aquarius or especially The Mountain. I personally felt that black metal didn't have a particularly strong year in 2018 after how good 2017 was as a genre, but I was still able to find a few releases that really struck a chord with me. I was aware of these guys before, but I'd never dug into their previous albums, so I was pleased to find that almost from the get-go, I found this album to be pretty enjoyable and refreshing. The main strength of this album is its diversity, touching upon some more straightforward and rockin' sounds, some moments of real intensity, some slower, sludgier tones, and even some progressive elements sprinkled throughout. It's a balance of many different black metal styles that still ends up feeling cohesive. I will say that the 5 minutes of strings at the end feels a bit drawn out, and not every track is as notable as the rest, but I still overall enjoyed this one quite a bit. Here's an album that suffers primarily from having coming out so early in the year and not particularly need a ton of releases to really digest and enjoy. The band plays a unique fusion of doom metal sounds with Americana elements mixed in, driven by powerful emotional resonance and slick grooves alike. I feel like this is an album that's really easy to get into and enjoy, but it is pretty straightforward when it wants to deliver to you, and the result can wear out quickly, with a few of the tracks feeling a bit dragged out on repeated listens. I still do absolutely recommend this one solely for its uniqueness and accessibility, and I would also recommend checking out the full album music video they have on YouTube for this if you do want to check it out. This album actually used to be on the list proper, but I found on re-listens that it hadn't had the same lasting impact as anything that did end up making the final list. This band takes a lot of bits and pieces from the modern prog metal scene and mixes them into a combination that doesn't quite sound like any other band out there. More than most of their contemporaries, there's a strong sense of emotional resonance to these tracks, and they have a talent for hooks that a lot of their contemporaries and prog metal imitators tend to lack. Where the album falls apart for me is mostly in its two longest tracks. While The Fool Who Would Be King is a killer song in its own right, its political topics can make it a bit of an uncomfortable listen. And the closer Mirage is just a disappointing, overlong finale that I've never much cared for. It's not the best album of the year, but they managed to usurp the most recent releases of a lot of bands they're clearly influenced by, which is a feat in of itself. Straight up, I was immediately in love with this band from the first time I heard the very first song on this album, though I really was in love with their sound. A very satisfying mix of melodic yet heavy tones with some dissonant, uneasy elements. A balance of harsh and clean vocals, a very spacious sound where guitar and bass are both clearly audible alongside each other, and straightforward songwriting with enough little moments and details to keep listens rewarding. Where it fell just short for me was in the lack of any emotional connection these songs tried to make. It's a very dry sound that, while pleasant to listen to, doesn't intend to reach for anything deeper. And with so much focus on the smaller details, songs can end up feeling a bit overlong due to lacking variety. Having said all that, it pains me that this just barely missed the list proper, as it's still a great album I've gotten plenty of spins out of. Consider this an honorary number 11. And with those all out of the way, it's on to the list proper. One genre I've been particularly big into in the past year is post-hardcore, and right towards the end of this year comes this album, a promising mix of post-hardcore with some more progressive and post-rock elements as well. To me, that's a match made in heaven, and predictably I ended up liking it quite a bit. Not as much as I was expecting to, mind you, since this barely scraped onto the list proper, and there's one primary reason for that. The first half of this album, the first 6 tracks, just aren't as good as the 6 that follow. They aren't bad songs at all, they're decently pleasant and they have their moments, but I just don't get as much out of them as the rest. Which means that I have to wait over 25 minutes to start getting to the stuff on this album that I really enjoy. Fortunately, the remaining nearly 40 minutes are pretty consistently great and only getting better as the album goes along. You've Made Yourself Perfectly Clear and Here Comes a Walking Fire are basically the fully realized versions of the style the first half of the album is shooting for. And Second Chances is just a gorgeous, particularly post-Dragon Fluids track, immediately followed by the very math-rocky Tonight We Don't Think We Do, which comes to one hell of a climax. And after a brief but beautiful reprieve, we get the final 13-minute closer track that runs the full spectrum of calm beauty to intense emotional turmoil. The run of those last 4 tracks in particular just destroy me every single time. Even if I'm not fully on board with this album the whole way through, thanks to the strong ending, I always come away from it quite satisfied. In contrast to Huntsman, here's an album from way early in the year that did remain in regular rotation and stuck with me quite a lot. And oddly enough, I expect this to be one of the most well-known bands on this entire list, too. The band plays a pretty unique fusion of mathcore with some more atmospheric and post-track elements, topped off with some gorgeous female vocal leads. And this album is, from what I've heard, their best thus far. I've enjoyed some of their previous albums of theirs that I've listened to, but not as much as this one. I think making their sound more accessible and straightforward, without losing the core elements that gave them their identity in the first place, was the right move. There's a ton of atmosphere throughout the record, and it functions as much as a cohesive piece as it does individual songs. And like many bands in the same vein, they do a good job of balancing their emotive side with their technical side. For me, mathcore tends to lean too far towards the latter, while post-rock leans a bit too far towards the former, but the fusion of the two covers the weaknesses of both. Alma Mater is the highlight of the entire bunch, for me the album's most intense moments, and doing so spectacularly. I also particularly like Balancing the Dark for its jazzy bookends and the tense build-up giving way to the track following it. Again, though, like the last record on this list, there's a definite turning point in this album for me where there's a solid gap in quality, though not quite as massive. That is to say, I like the front half of this record a fair bit more than the back half. Or at the very least, I don't find the last 4 songs here as compelling or memorable as the first 6, and the longer tracks in general can feel a bit drawn out. Most of the best stuff is found in the shorter, tighter cuts. Really though, as much as I do like this album, it ended up here almost by default simply due to the number of spins it received from me over the course of the year. And it's not the last album on the list I'd say the same for either, but we'll get to that. On the whole, this was probably my earliest favorite of the year, and I'm definitely interested in seeing where the band takes their sound next. Following up on my earlier comments towards black metal, this is actually the highest anything from the genre reached for me this year. And it's pretty funny, because this one sure took its time growing on me. Immediately I was struck by the mystical, unsettling sound of this band, mixing black metal elements with elements of progressive metal and even hints of power metal of all things. And I'd say the real strength of this album is how they toe the line of dissonance and melody enough to drive some really intense moments, even more so than the aforementioned Spires record. But on further re-listens, something didn't quite work for me. This album is unique up front, but its sound can be a little dry. Again, lacking in emotional depth outside of the moments where it's trying to instill a deep sense of terror in you. Yet, I kept coming back to it, more than albums than I thought I liked more, and it eventually wormed its way here onto the list proper. I think the biggest strength for this album is how most of the individual songs have their own place and distinct flavor, but are still very strongly unified by the band's unique sound. The first 2 full tracks drive the more intense and chaotic moments of the album, while the last 2 tracks play up the more technical and melodic side of their sound, with the remaining 2 being the more relaxed intro and interlude tracks. And I will say that the one big sticking point for me of this album, even still, is that interlude track. It feels a bit out of place and just off in general. And for me, it kills the momentum of the album a little. I do appreciate that, again, the music on this album is plenty technical, but never to the point of overindulgence. There are these huge, long songs that seem pretty straightforward on the surface, but have layers of little details and moments scattered across them that make them just as enjoyable the 20th time as the first time. Again, at the end of the day, this one is probably here just because of the number of plays it got for me, but for as unique and memorable as I found it, I think it rightfully deserves it. So this is the first album on this list where a band supposedly is aping the style of another band. Why I don't give the slightest damn about that is because this album far surpasses anything I've heard from the aforementioned band. I don't really buy an argument of plagiarism when you're simply improving on an established formula. That's how progress is made, guys. Anyways, the sound of this album at its core is what really appeals to me here. I don't even think there's really value in getting into any individual songs here. I honestly wouldn't be able to tell you what their names are or what most of them sound like, even though I'm certain this is my top 3 most played albums of the year. I was on board with this just from how strongly they play up the atmosphere and more melodic side of technical death metal. And really, this album has such a great ebb and flow to it throughout that creates that cohesive feel that really transcends the need for any individual song to stand out anyways. There are a few tracks that are mostly or entirely synth driven, but there are just as many playing up melodic guitar lines or driving some real intense heaviness. And while nothing they're doing is inherently groundbreaking, they're just doing it so damn well that I'm not concerned about how derivative it might be. I will admit that what keeps it from placing any higher on this list is exactly that though. While, yes, the album is pretty strong as a whole, it does lack those real high points and individually strong songs that can really elevate an album. And it did face some pretty tough competition too. Still, absolutely an album I can wholeheartedly recommend though, which I don't think I can quite say about anything below it on this list so far. Probably the earliest album I got this year that I had locked for this list, and a pretty bizarre pick at that. I mean, Christian, progressive, death metal. That's sure a thing that exists, alright. In defiance of that label though, this album is very legit and very compelling to boot. And it's probably the heaviest album on this list as well. The most extreme parts of this are about as heavy as metal can go while still having appeal to me, but it's also one of the most diverse and revisitable albums of the year for me as well. Practically every song feels like it's touching a different ground than any of the others. The first 2 tracks are among the heaviest, and admittedly the weakest for me. They were kind of a roadblock for me getting into this album at first. But even still, they have some strong moments. And pretty much every track from there on gets more adventurous, with some doomier moments, a 10-minute instrumental, and the most progressive and varied stuff situated towards the back half of the album. Considering the genres involved, I find a surprising amount of this still very accessible and even kind of catchy at times. And while most every track tends to have a ton of ideas, it never feels too indulgent and the tracks don't feel overly loaded. Ideas are repeated just enough and moments linger just long enough to feel satisfying and overall cohesive. I will stress that this is right at the limit of heaviness for me, at least in death metal, and there are definitely the occasional moments where that gets overbearing for me, which is probably the one thing keeping this from being even higher on this list. But this has remained a favorite of me throughout most of the year, and definitely an album I'd highly recommend. The second of 2 albums on this list from an artist I've seen accused of ripping off another band. Unlike the previous case, the style they're, taking inspiration from is a style that's almost never worked for me previously. But, again, I don't think they're fully leaning into another band's style so much as taking some elements and moving it towards a different, more melodic and progressive direction. And if you've been paying attention to this list so far, it's pretty obvious that's the direction that appeals to me. Despite that, I kind of struggled with where this one should end up. And that's for one main reason. This album is wildly inconsistent. The high points are stunningly high, some of the highest of the year for me. But there are more weak moments on this album than any other on this list. Most notably the songs that fail to add that layer of depth outside of just straight pounding intensity. This album, again, can be surprisingly catchy and accessible at moments. For example, the big closing epic, The Inward Eye. It has all the facets of a long, multi-movement epic, as you'd expect, but there's a killer chorus tying it all together, an element I've historically felt has made some of the best epics as strong as they are. I'd easily call this one of the best prog epics of the year, and one of the best songs of the year outright. I especially love the touches of saxophone throughout. On the flip side, the album opener, Colossus, is the best example of the album using its heavier side right, mixing some pounding riffs with real emotional intensity, especially that build towards the end. Mix that with a handful of calmer and more melodic songs that serve as nice reprieve from the heavier moments, and it's a very balanced album overall, even if, again, I don't find it quite as consistent as I'd like. At the end of the day, though, there's much more music here that I truly love than there's music that I'm mad towards. And I don't treat albums as a zero-sum game, as long as there are enough killer tracks to keep me coming back time and time again like this album has. And at this point in the list, we're up to the albums that are pretty exclusively one sound just done really well, and done with enough variety to never feel stale. And here's what this one does: melodic and technical progressive death metal. It's pretty consistently heavy, but it's just as consistently melodic to prevent the album from devolving into boring chugging. While this album pretty much sticks to its core sound across this hour-long runtime, it still remains dynamic and diverse enough to remain compelling throughout. The primary feature of a lot of this album is jagged and melodic guitar riffs and melodies, but that's really only a part of the picture. There are some calmer moments, some dense and atmospheric moments, some killer grooves, and two full-on epic tracks to go through most of the different sides of their sound. Biomorph in particular stands out as the highlight for me, a full 3-part suite, going through calmer atmosphere, straightforward and intense metal, and even some more off-kilter moments, including the addition of a choir. But for me, the biggest strength of this album is how unfailingly consistent it is. There's literally only one single moment in this album that I can point to as being under par for this album, that being a kind of sloppy bass groove towards the end of Aaron Dringen's Invade. And even saying that, that groove does build into something great eventually. And I don't feel the highest points of this album quite reach the highest of others on this list, both above and below it, which is what keeps it from being any higher here. Basically, what's on display here is one of the most solid and consistently enjoyable hours of metal I've heard all year. This was a near instant hit for me and one of the highlights of the later months of the year, and I have absolutely no qualms about putting it this high on the list. But I also feel it doesn't even come remotely close to the remaining 3 albums on this list. And on that note, so here's the first of the big 3 for me. Not a band I was familiar with before this year, but from what I've checked out, this seems like a radical shift from the band's previous sound, and in my opinion, absolutely for the better. I was won over pretty quick on their mixture of doom metal with brighter tones and elements of psychedelic rock, and this album kept me coming back quite a lot in the later months of the year. And the real strength of this album isn't just how emotionally intense it is. The soaring vocal performances delivered over lush and heavy atmospheres, and the moments of quiet, somber beauty in between. While there are individual tracks, and each of them absolutely have their own identity, the strength of this album is in how well it flows as a cohesive unit. The songs flow effortlessly into each other smoothly, and the progression across the album's runtime just feels natural, like one 36-minute long piece. And that piece's finale is the phenomenal closer, The Warm Glow, which is easily a Song of the Year candidate for me. Just intensely powerful stuff. Throughout the album, there are some instrumental jam moments reminiscent of their earlier work too, though kept brief enough not to feel overlong or obstructive, and they're always welcome when they occur. Really, the only thing I can fault this album for is how short it feels. I could see this being stretched out to 45 minutes easily and being just as powerful without feeling drawn out. But at the same time, I'm not really sure I'd want to change what we got. It's not an album that I really have as much to say about because it's an album that's really easy to get into, at least for me, and I can't say I've ever heard anything quite like it. Absolutely go check this one out. Also, God, that gorgeous album art. I love it. Almost certainly the biggest grower of the year for me, as this was an album I very nearly passed up even getting in the first place. But obviously I'm glad I did, as it turned out to be one of my absolute favorites of the year. And I suspect that with even more time, this could overtake my number 1 too. And this was definitely the best found in terms of post-hardcore for me this year, and a year where I really got into the genre. There's basically 2 elements to make this album as strong as it is. The band has a talent for building songs around strong hooks, lots of moments of raw intensity, and surprisingly non-linear song structures that keep the songs a lot more listenable than standard post-hardcore fare. And on top of that, the themes of this album. This isn't an album of teenage angst, nor is it a requiem for love gone wrong, like so many albums in a similar vein. No, as someone in their mid-20s, I just find this incredibly relatable. Songs like Pendulum Days, On Your Laurels, and especially Dilettante have themes surrounding a sense of stagnation that I really feel. Basically the mission statement of why I'm even putting this video together at all. And then there's In Your Ways, the other really strong song of the year candidate for me. with the best chorus on the album, calling out the type of person who offloads all their problems onto someone else without taking responsibility for themselves, the type of person I'm all too familiar with. And then there's an entire conversation that could be had about the themes of romanticizing depression, like found in the uptake, or the sense of lost nostalgia that permeates the title track. And the intensity this album can build up at its lowest moments is incredible, too. The climaxes of Lo and Beholden and the title track in particular are some of the best and most powerful I've heard in the genre, or heck, in any genre, period. All while they keep the songs melodic and instrumentally interesting, avoiding falling into the trap of metalcore chugging or generic post-rock twinkles. Not to mention how the album flows from track to track in a way that makes the whole package feel a lot more cohesive, not just like a collection of songs. I genuinely, at this point, am unable to criticize anything beyond the fact that one particular song, Well-Being, is a bit lacking in comparison to most songs here, but that's only by comparison, as I would say it'd easily be set anything on the first half of the aforementioned Even the Trees album. And the album, despite its strong hooks, wasn't very immediate for me, though I don't know how immediate others would find it. I've come back to this one time and time again, almost as much as on number 1, and it's absolutely earned its high place up on this list. And closing off my list full of all sorts of metal and metal adjacent albums is an instrumental progressive rock and jazz album. But god damn, this album, man. So, I have a criteria that what makes a truly great album is when I enjoy an album so much, it makes me want to seek out others like it. And that's definitely something I've done in the months following when I got into this album. To diminishing returns, unfortunately, but that's irrelevant. What matters is this album just plain rocks. I'll get my negatives out of the way here on this one immediately. There's a 1-minute interlude that I don't like. That's it. That leaves well over 65 minutes of music that I fully and wholly enjoy. I think what this album's biggest strength is that for an instrumental album, there are a surprising amount of hooks here. Every song has a few main melodic hooks, but even a lot of the more transient moments are really sticky and memorable. I've had random moments of this album playing in my head for close to a year now, basically since its release. And the album musically blends a lot of different moves. Some jagged, progressive grooves, some more straightforward, rollicking grooves, some spacey psychedelic jams, and some loud, in-your-face moments. Every track feels less like a cohesive song and more like a multi-movement suite strung together, which I could see as a downside if I didn't think every individual segment was so damn strong. And no idea overstayed its welcome to the point of tedium. I really feel like I can't do this album enough justice just by talking about it, so I'm just gonna leave it there and ask that you go check it out for yourself, because it really is something special. I don't have any means to determine what album I listened to the most in 2018, but I have a strong suspicion it was this one. And I checked out the EP they released early in the year as well, which was good, but not even in the same league as this album. At the end of the day, I was running for a long while that nothing was going to top this album for me, and it very much deserves all the praise I've heaped upon it here. And that's the list. If you made it this far, I very much appreciate it, and I hope you found something here that you want to check out for yourself. And if not, or if you just absolutely hated this video, please remember to dislike and leave an angry comment for me. I definitely plan to do more videos like this in the future, and I had a lot of fun putting this one together, for sure. Even if it took me almost half the year to finally do so. Anyways, I'm gonna go back to jamming out the Polymath now. See y'all later.